So hello, welcome everybody to today's Ask the Author session from the International Transport Forum on carbon pricing in shipping. My name is Ronan Mackerlane. I'm from the Communications Unit at the International Transport Forum, and I'm joined today by Olaf Merk, our ports and shipping expert and lead author of the report on carbon pricing in shipping. This is a report that was released last week to coincide with the International Maritime Organization's Committees on Sustainable Maritime Transport, and has received huge media echo and views and download figures since its publication last week. So the format, if you don't know the Ask the Author already, is that our lead author will give you an approximately 10-minute presentation of the main findings and methodology behind the report. And then the main impetus of this session is to allow you to ask the questions to our expert, Olaf Merk. To do so, and you can do so from now, you can put your questions into the Q&A, the question and answer function within your Zoom window. We will moderate the questions and try to get through as many of them as possible. So just before the presentation, you can already put your questions into the Q&A. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Olaf Merk for the presentation.
Yeah, so thank you very much, and thank you very much for your interest in this new report. Before I present its findings, a bit of context on the report. It is actually the output of a shipping group that we had and that we have conducted over the last 2 years, called the Common Interest Group on Decarbonizing of Shipping, where we looked at carbon pricing as its main topic. And in that group, we have over the last 2 years discussed many of the proposals that countries have submitted to the International Maritime Organization on carbon pricing. We have discussed this with, of course, with the member countries and with diverse maritime stakeholders that are represented in the group. The draft report has also been submitted to the the special working group of the IMO that is working on these issues, and that took place the 5th to the 9th of December, and indeed it has also been released as a separate ITF report last week. So what is in the report? Well, essentially 6 different topics that I will also try to briefly explain here. So what is the rationale for carbon pricing in shipping? What are the main findings actually on carbon pricing in general? Has there been a practice of carbon pricing in shipping? What have been the impacts of carbon pricing in shipping? And what are the current proposals for carbon pricing in shipping? And then finally, I'll talk of the main policy issues that we have identified and the recommendations that we propose in our report. So that is essentially what I'll try to do, and I'll try to do that in 10 minutes. So what is the rationale for carbon pricing in shipping? Well, first, the observation that a lot of policy ambition is needed to align shipping to the Paris climate goals. And what we identified as a main challenge is the lack of commercial viability of zero carbon shipping operations, so zero carbon fuels or zero carbon energy sources. Why is that? Well, essentially because there is a price gap between the conventional fuels and zero carbon fuels or zero emission fuels. And this forms essentially a bottleneck for the uptake and for the deployment of these zero emission shipping operations. And carbon pricing could help to bridge that price gap. So if you put a price on carbon and on the emissions of the greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, and you do that high enough, you can actually bridge the gap between conventional fuels and what could be the zero emission fuels. So that is the idea. That is the rationale for carbon pricing in shipping. When you look at carbon pricing, you see that it has been deployed in many different countries and in also in various different sectors. So a World Bank report on carbon pricing identified 68 national, subnational, supranational carbon pricing schemes are operational in 2022, covering around 23% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. But only one of these actually covers shipping, that is the carbon tax in Norway. So what has been, let's say, the findings of the literature on carbon pricing in general? What can we learn from that and what could be applied to shipping? One finding that stands out is that carbon pricing alone is often seen as inefficient, as insufficient as a measure, and that is in many cases because carbon prices are actually low and actually too low to really have a lot of an impact. But what has also been found is that carbon pricing has been effective in the cases where it has been combined with other measures, for example, with standards or with R&D, with subsidies or other policy measures. It's also been observed that carbon pricing can generate significant revenues that could, of course, be used for technology development in zero carbon technologies and infrastructure. Then, what has been the practice of carbon pricing in shipping? Well, as I mentioned, there isn't a lot of experience with carbon pricing schemes. And actually, there isn't really a lot of experience with other forms of, well, pricing carbon or emissions from shipping either. So fuels for international shipping are generally exempted from taxation, so there's not a really incentive there. And that is also more or less the same case for the taxation of fuels for domestic shipping, with a few exceptions that are on this slide. I already mentioned carbon pricing schemes generally exclude the shipping sector, and with only one exception. But there are a few pricing schemes that that could serve as some sort of a reference. One of them is the NOx fund that exists again in Norway, that has certain incentives for shipping that could be compared to carbon pricing schemes. So with actually little practice in carbon pricing in shipping, it is of course difficult to see what have been the practical impacts, the impacts in practice from carbon pricing. But there are quite a few studies that try to model or that try to estimate the impacts of potential carbon pricing schemes on the basis, for example, of what happens with when fuel prices change. So this is a brief overview of some of the findings of those studies. Of course, a lot more in the report, but it shows that there can be impacts on ship speed, on energy efficiency of ships, and that the price gap could also be bridged, and that it could be the technology development as long as the carbon price is sufficiently high. Could be an impact on shipping routes, so carbon pricing could facilitate the shorter shipping routes or stimulate those. And carbon pricing could have an impact on the demand for shipping. The idea is that the freight cost, maritime freight costs would go up, and that could be from very marginal to up to 16% higher maritime freight costs, and this could have an impact on the demand for shipping, especially for low value added goods. There's also a few studies that looked at possible impacts on global trade and productions, and the existing studies find very small impacts actually on this. And that is probably because either because imports and exports actually in most countries are not very important parts of the economy, and also because some of the let's say the losses from international trade are also offset by domestic production and investments. So this is an overview of some of the potential impacts in case carbon pricing would be introduced in shipping. That brings me to the next part of the report, which is essentially an analysis and an assessment of the different proposals that have been submitted officially to the International Maritime Organization when it comes to carbon pricing. We have identified 5 of these proposals that are in this table, and these have been developed over the last essentially over the last 2 years. So there are 2 proposals for levies. So that is a levy on ships that would serve as a carbon pricing mechanism. There is a proposal for a fee bait. So the idea there is that it is a levy, but the part of the revenues will be immediately invested back into zero emission vessels. So the idea is that will be a rebate from the fee that will be large enough for these vessels to actually bridge the gap between conventional and zero emission fuels. Then there is another proposal that is some sort of a reward and a penalty system. So the ships with better carbon intensity scores, they get a reward, and ships with lower scores, they get a penalty. There's a cap and trade proposal, and that is essentially the 5 proposals when it comes to carbon pricing. I also added another proposal that is not carbon pricing as such, but that is related, and that is a proposal for a global fuel standard that could also help to bring down, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions from shipping. So these are the 5 main proposals when it comes to carbon pricing. Here are a few more details in this table. Of course, we explain much more about how that should work in the report. Another table that is to show that there are quite some differences between the different proposals when it comes to what is actually covered. What are ship sizes that are covered? In some cases, let's say also very small ships are included. Maybe another important question, of course, is are carbon emissions, are they included, or does it include all greenhouse gas emissions? And finally, when it comes to coverage, it's also important to know which proposals are actually talking about the tank to wake, so let's say the emissions that actually take place on board of a ship, and which ones are also taking into account all the upstream and downstream emissions. So that is the well-to-wake emissions that also take into account, for example, the emissions from the production of ship fuels. I just show this to make sure that that you understand there's a lot of differences between the proposals that will need to be worked out, of course, when there are discussions on how to go forward. Another important issue is on how the revenues from carbon pricing should be spent in the different proposals. There's a lot of text here in this slide, but essentially most of the proposals propose that some of the revenues go back to the in-sector spending, so that some of it is spent on research and development, for example, or deployment or capacity building within the shipping sector, and that could help to facilitate the decarbonization. Some proposals also propose climate change adaptation and mitigation for countries that are most affected. And generally, there's also the idea that these revenues could help to compensate for disproportionate negative impacts for certain countries from carbon pricing. So there are 5 different proposals that have been formulated. We tried to assess them, and we think in the end, in the assessment, it boils down to a couple of important policy issues. The first one is how could the different elements be combined towards a global solution? And the important question there, we think, is what actually is the vision on the pathway of decarbonization in these different proposals? And you could say that there are essentially 2 different views in this, more or less explicitly formulated. So one could be the early deployment of zero emission ships by first movers. And another vision, which is slightly different and assumes some sort of a transition of low carbon ships before they actually become zero carbon. And our view, our analysis here is that it would be preferable to make an immediate leap towards the zero emission ships, and that is because a lot of the ships have very long lifetimes. Then there's questions on revenue use and the need to combine carbon pricing with other measures, including standards. For the sake of time, I'll not go into this now. There's the question of how to make sure that global schemes will not interfere with regional schemes, and that is all the more relevant because the EU has decided to include shipping in its emissions trading scheme. So that is something that needs attention, and to make sure that there will not be duplication when there will be a global measure. And finally, there is an issue of competition and the issue of access for smaller operators, but also on the question of costs that might be passed on to consumers. I'd be happy to talk more about that, but I think for the sake of time, I'll leave the discussion of policy issues at this. I'll just show you our own policy recommendations. What we recommend is actually a mix of measures, so not carbon pricing as a standalone measure, but carbon pricing combined with other measures, including standards. When it comes to the design of the carbon pricing measure, we would recommend a fee-based system, so to finance zero emission vessel operations and use that mechanism to completely bridge the price gap. We would also recommend a technical design requirement for new builds, a low carbon fuel standard that has gradually more stringent targets. We would propose that the substantial revenues will be used for mitigation and adaptation in small island development states and least developed countries, but there is also revenues will be spent in sector to facilitate decarbonization of the sector. And finally, we propose that this instrument will be covering the emissions on a well-to-wake basis so as to be most effective when it comes to the decarbonization of shipping. I'll stop here my presentation, but of course I would be very happy to answer any questions that you have on this report.
Thank you very much indeed, Olaf, for a very concise, short presentation on what is a very complicated topic. Of course, you have the link for the report if you haven't already downloaded it in the chat, which will have much more detail on each of the points that Olaf made. As Olaf mentioned, this work is part of our ongoing in-depth work on what are considered the hard to decarbonize sectors: aviation, maritime, and heavy-duty road freight. There's a link in the chat for more information on each of the common interest groups working on those 3 areas. So from now, you can put your questions using into the Q&A function in your Zoom window, and the questions are already coming in. And to kick off, Olaf, there's first a general question Given that the maritime sector must decarbonize for us to mitigate the climate crisis, why is this such a controversial topic? Why is carbon pricing so controversial?
Yes, thank you, Ronan. That's a good question. Indeed, the issue of carbon pricing in shipping is controversial. There has been a long discussion on carbon pricing in shipping between, I think it was between 2006 and 2013 at the international level. And that was a discussion that didn't lead to any results. And that is because this issue is difficult to resolve. Essentially because many countries have concerns about their exports or their imports and the price of that, if there will be a large price on carbon. So the idea is that shipping costs will increase, and that could harm the exports or the imports of these countries. That is generally, I think, probably the most important reason why it is a controversial issue. But then, as I said, I mean, some of the impact studies that we looked at, they seem to suggest that the economic effects are or could actually be fairly small. Of course, there's a lot of differences. It could be worse for certain countries, maybe especially the countries at the periphery of shipping routes. But there could also be economic opportunities for decarbonizing shipping. So there needs to be a lot of alternative fuels, a lot of renewable energy to actually make sure that these are green fuels. So there's also economic opportunities for many countries. But that said, it is important to take into account possible and potential negative impacts for countries, and that is also at the core, I think, of the international discussion. And that is also why this whole discussion on the revenues from carbon pricing is so important. So why is it controversial? Many countries are afraid it will harm their exports. But we think it could be resolved by looking very carefully at impacts and how it could be compensated.
Okay, thanks indeed. And thanks for enlightening us on the different mechanisms that are being studied around carbon fuel pricing. There's a question from Eddie van Boevel, who refers to the EU Maritime proposal, which is a standard with a pooling option and a penalty system, which sets a clear carbon pricing signal. Has this mechanism been considered in the study or in the report, Olaf?
Yes. So we described also a few of the EU initiatives that have been proposed, and some of them have already been introduced. I didn't mention all of that in this presentation because, well, that is actually something that has been ongoing for a while, and that is now also taking place. A fuel standard, as this has been formulated at the EU level, is also something that has been actually proposed by EU and several EU countries at the global level. So there is clearly also a parallel between the EU discussion and the global discussion.
Thanks indeed. A question from Rosie Allen. Rosie asks, how compatible would a fuel levy be with an emissions trading scheme, and could the two complement each other?
Well, generally it is one or the other. So either you take a levy, or let's say a levy or a tax. In many cases they want to call it a levy because that sounds less dangerous. Or an emissions trading scheme, and that is because let's say the mechanisms are a little bit different. Of course, when you impose a levy, that means you impose the carbon price, but you don't impose the let's say the emissions trajectory. And with a cap and trade system, it is actually the other way around. So you impose kind of the emissions trajectory that you have in mind, and well, in many cases, of course, this should go down. But you actually don't impose the price of carbon, because that is determined by the market, that is determined by the carbon pricing mechanism. So in practice, you see either one or the other. So to combine it doesn't seem to happen a lot in practice.
Okay, there's a follow-up question from Eddie van Boevel, who says that given the urgency of the climate crisis, would it be possible to leapfrog to zero carbon fuels in parallel with transition measures, for example, using biofuels in existing vessels?
Yes, well, this is indeed the whole question that we have also been kind of struggling with in this report. That is, what is the most efficient and effective measure to achieve both? Because you actually want to achieve both. What we think is that the fee-based mechanism, as it has been also recommended in our report, could achieve this leapfrogging, because it means that you take a little bit from all ships and you actually give a lot of that to zero emission vessels, and that would make it possible for them, so for the first movers, to actually immediately go to zero emission operations. So you would, in a way, you would stimulate the leapfrogging. So that's why we are in favor of such a mechanism. Then at the same time, of course, you'd also like to make sure that the others are also transitioning, and that could be, well, let's say, in a less radical way. So that's why we propose our carbon pricing mechanism in combination with some sort of a fuel standard that regularly declines, so that there will also be some sort of a transition for the others.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a reminder for all our panelists to send us your questions. Please use the Q&A function. That helps us to moderate the questions and get through as many as we can, of which there are many. I'm just going to launch a quick poll that you'll see on your screen to help us improve this format. Let us know whether you like it or not. So to the next question from Aditi Kushik, who's from Fiata, who asks, how do you suggest the cost of emissions be distributed between supply chain stakeholders and customers?
Yes, well, that is a question that that we looked at, and that I didn't really have the time to develop in this presentation, because I think it's an important question. There's an important link between carbon pricing and, let's say, the state of competition of shipping that could answer this question. So when you look, there is some literature looking at are costs from carbon pricing or fuel costs, are they being passed on to customers, or are they being absorbed by shipping companies? And what appears from those studies is that it depends on, well, on the, let's say, the state of competition, and whether shipping companies are in a favorable position in that respect. So when they are in a favorable position, for example, when freight rates are high, when they really have a strong negotiation position, what has been shown is that a lot of the costs have been passed on to customers. When the situation was less favorable to shipping companies, this was the reverse. So they absorbed a lot of these costs, well, in their own operations without passing it on. Which means that there is an important link when you talk about this with, well, let's say, the regulation of competition of shipping. And well, we have written other reports about that, and I'll not talk about that. But it seems to show that, well, when we talk about carbon pricing, it's also important to think about these issues and to make sure that competition authorities are well equipped to guarantee competition in the market, in order to avoid that some of the costs are simply passed on to consumers and nothing really happens in the behavior of shipping companies.
Thanks, Olaf. The question from Beatrice Gonzalez: outside the shipping sector, how can we make sure that market-based incentives for the use of alternative fuels in shipping do not take away the renewable energy capacity for other industries, which may even be more polluting. And as Beatrice says, consider that shipping is 3% or less than man-made CO2 emissions.
Yeah, this is of course always the question. That is especially the question, of course, if you have a separate carbon pricing scheme for shipping, because that means that, well, you decide that shipping has to decarbonize. It would be different, of course, if you would include shipping into, let's say, another global scheme that, well, that could be there, but that actually doesn't exist. Because if you would include shipping as one of the sectors with others, then of course it's kind of the, let's say, the markets that would decide where it would be best to abate quickly, and that would depend on where it is easiest and where, let's say, I have to say where is the most of the low-hanging fruit. So that obviously isn't the case if you have a separate carbon pricing scheme for shipping, which means that indeed you'll need to be, well, policymakers need to be attentive to well, the sort of direction they are pushing a sector towards, and in some cases that would indeed mean that these policymakers have to think about, well, what would be the best use for renewable energies that are at this moment not at full capacity. But of course, the ideal solution would be that the scale up of renewable energy would be such a scale that this is an issue that it's at a certain point becomes well, irrelevant, and that is also why we think it is important to make clear that this should be the decarbonization path of shipping, so that at least for this sector, it is clear what could be the renewable energy needs that would need to be produced and need to be taken into account.
Thanks very much, Olaf. Quick link in the chat to subscribe to ITF newsletters and alerts. We'll have a lot more content on decarbonizing transport coming up in 2023. And we've time for a few more questions, so don't hesitate to pop them into the Q&A function in your Zoom window. A question from Jorge Lubano. What is the chance that dirty ships would be allocated to relatively low traffic routes? And he gives the example for South American ones. Can that be a problem?
Yes, well, that depends. It depends on, of course, on the behavior of shipping companies, the operators of ships. In a way, it also depends on, let's say, the emergence of certain regional carbon pricing schemes. So, of course, we will have one for shipping within the EU. So that means that operators that will be operating to and from Europe, well, they have an incentive to use the cleanest ships on these routes. There are possibilities that similar schemes will be introduced in other parts of the world. I think China is looking carefully at this, what's happening at the EU level. So it is possible indeed, if you would have a situation in which several, let's say, large trading blocks would have their own carbon pricing schemes in which shipping would be included, that there is an incentive for shipping companies to, well, divert their dirtiest ships to the places where there's no such schemes. But that's also showing why it is relevant to have and to develop kind of a global mechanism and a global carbon pricing scheme, so that actually all ships on all routes will start to decarbonize. Okay,
and speaking of a global scheme, there's a last question in from Roshi Zhang, who's asking, how do you vision decarbonization affecting international shipping connectivity?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. There's different angles you could take, of course. In principle, let's say the effect of carbon pricing on the demand for maritime transport seems to be fairly small. So you probably wouldn't expect to be an important decrease in maritime trade. So you could well assume that, let's say, the maritime connectivity between nations could be more or less similar. But of course, there will be a lot of changes when it comes to different flows, because if decarbonization really comes on steam, so really takes off, that means that a lot of the commodities that are now transported by maritime transport, like coal or crude oil or also gas, will be transported to a much lesser degree in the future. And there might be other commodities that would be necessary for renewable energies. Could be ammonia, could be hydrogen that will be much more transported by sea. So there might be a reconfiguration of maritime flows that, of course, can have an impact also on the maritime connectivity of certain countries.
That's a good hopeful note, Olaf. We've got time just for one more question. I wouldn't mind going into the specifics of why you consider the fee-based system as the more attractive, given all of the different mechanisms. Could you outline why that's a particular recommendation in this report, Olaf?
Yes, well, the reason essentially is that I mentioned a lot of the let's say the studies on carbon pricing and their effectiveness. They show that, well, sometimes it's difficult for carbon pricing schemes to be effective because you need a very high price for carbon for it to really have an impact. And also, when I talked about the rationale for it in shipping, I mentioned, well, it actually ideally should bridge the price gap between conventional fuels and zero emission fuels. And of course, if you have, let's say, a levy, or also if you have cap and trades, you would need a very high carbon price to achieve that. What is attractive, I think, about the fee-based system is that you can actually lower that price because there is some sort of an automatic rebate system that diverts the revenues automatically to the zero emission vessels. That is the idea. So you have a carbon price, but it's not the carbon price in itself that does the effect. That is less the revenue that is immediately reinvested in a select group of ships that are zero emission. That does the trick. So that's why we think that could be really effective and doesn't require a very high carbon price at the beginning.
Okay, thank you. I think we've one last question. I think we've already touched on this, but thank you, YU Angora, for your question, who correctly says carbon pricing will rise the logistical cost, and how can we be sure that it can remain economically sustainable, especially in developing countries? So I think that's covered on the pricing mechanism. Do you want to add anything else to that, Olaf?
No, that is indeed is an essential question. As I mentioned, yeah, so you need to have very good impact studies that identify this from the outset. Of course, a lot will also then change during the process. You will need to monitor that. I mentioned there's also a lot of economic opportunities that developing countries can also use, and so a lot of renewable energy production will be needed to create green shipping fuels, for example, and some of the developing countries are particularly well placed to do that. But then what is also very important is to have a compensation mechanism that clearly compensates developing countries for disproportionate negative impacts, so that indeed their impacts on trade will be mitigated.
Thanks indeed, Olaf. We're going to leave the session at that. Do stay in touch with ITF. We're always open to your suggestions and comments. You can do it directly by contacting us using our social media links that are in the chat. Thank you very much for your excellent questions and for your interest in this topic. And as we say, there'll be more coming next year. And thank you very much indeed, Olaf Merk, for your excellent presentation and taking time to take these questions.